sure. So first of all, again, thanks, Matt, for joining us. Just start off, maybe introduce yourself and give us a little bit of context, a little bit of background, how you got where you are today.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Matt Leacock. I'm a game designer. I do board games. Been doing it full time since 2014, I guess. Best known for the board game Pandemic, but I've done a number of other games as well. So a lot of cooperative games. And I started out as a user experience designer. Before that, a graphic designer. And I just kind of like shifted from that field of work into game design and made it my career.
It's always interesting too, as well. As my background is in computer science and software engineering, so obviously I've done some UI UX stuff, so I can kind of see the overlap. But
Yeah.
From your perspective, what is kind of the overlap there, and how was that transition for you?
Sure. So I guess the roots of it for me were in visual communication and graphic design. So I started there, like learning how to communicate things, concepts visually, and then moving into interaction design, trying to figure out how to develop an experience. Think about how someone interacts with a piece of software, essentially. And both of those really apply to game design really heavily because game's just like a big UI sitting in front of you in one sense. You're trying to communicate different concepts through it, and you're having an experience. So you could think of game design as user experience design. The methods used, I think, overlap almost 100%. I mean, so there's lots of iterative design. So you come up with I don't know, you come up with like a scientific experiment, as it were, like a stimulus or a prototype, and you put it in front of people and you see what happens, and you form a hypothesis as to how you think it's going to work, and then you see how it actually works, and it's terrible. You tweak it, and you do that all again, and then you can use a lot of those iterative patterns and the research methods that you use for user experience design, and just apply them directly to game design.
Awesome. It's like you're kind of segued into the next question as well, actually. So I was curious a little bit more about the iterative process, specifically maybe if you could elaborate on kind of the play testing aspects, and then I guess specifically, Pandemic is such a well-balanced game. Were there any kind of features that were significant early on that kind of got removed through that iterative process?
Yeah, sure. I can cover both those. So I like to do paper prototyping when I did UX design because it was fast and iterative. Before a lot of our tools were as robust as they are now. You could put just simple paper concepts in front of someone and see how they reacted to it, and then just tear them up or change them in real time right in front of people to iterate very rapidly. So one of the things I really like to be able to do is have super disposable prototypes that I can change quickly. So it's important to be able to change things fast and be really agile in that regard. So I think that covers the first one to some extent. I mean, basically just getting things kind of raw. The first Pandemic board I tested on myself, and it was just a piece of newsprint with a couple markers and some cubes and so on. It was very disposable. And then, in developing Pandemic, there were a lot of ideas that I was really attached to that I had to kind of let go of over time. I'd spent 3 years working on it from the beginning of the concept to when I kind of pitched it. And then there's another year working with the publisher before it finally hit the shelves. So it was a long development process. It generally doesn't take that long for me now. But I can think of one thing, like the game used to have one single deck of cards in it that ran the players pulled cards from there for melding their hand, and they were also used to infect the world. So if you're familiar with the game right now, there's 2 decks. And the reason there's 2 decks now is that people were consistently screwing up the way that game works. So in that version, the early version of the game, you had 1 draw pile, but you had 2 different discard piles. And it didn't matter how often I told players or how much I emphasized it in the rules. They just always screwed it up. So I had to separate that into 2 decks of cards. And once I did that, the problems went away.
Were there also issues, I guess, with distribution because it was 2 different kinds of cards in there, or?
I mean, it was different, right? It worked. It was different. And then by splitting it, I could do lots of other things. I could put event cards in there because when you're infecting, you draw an event card. You're like, what the hell do I do with this? So, yeah, it created all sorts of different opportunities doing that, and it really just came from watching people screw up over and over again and realizing I couldn't be there to correct them.
I think that's interesting that that's kind of the way you see it in games or a lot of other prototype design outside of that as well, as you want to prevent catastrophic failures. And I think that's kind of the, something like that where it's going to cause the game not to be enjoyable. You want to prevent that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it, is like sort of defensive design, and error prevention, that sort of thing. And again, you really just watching to see, oh, this is a real risk. If this happens, then that's going to be really catastrophic. So how can we prevent that? How can we make it obvious that you would never want to do that?
Perfect. So at the beginning, you kind of mentioned that a lot of the games you've designed have been more on the cooperative style. I was just curious, can you talk a little bit about why is that, maybe that's a favorite style of yours or what you enjoy about the co-op style of games?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One, I just like playing with my family a lot more. I played some cutthroat competitive games here, and they haven't always gone over real well. So I just found that playing co-op games, it doesn't matter if we win or lose, we all really enjoy the process. So, some of our favorite games are when things have really gone down in flames. Where that's different, like if one person just completely annihilates the other, then there's a lot of bad feelings. So I liked it for that reason. And then the other is I just really like designing like, I guess, artificial opponents or AIs that fight against the players. I find that really a interesting design challenge. And I guess the third thing would be it does make it a little bit easier to play test, because I can play against the fake opponent.
Right.
Where when I'm doing a competitive game, actually I have to get two different people. They have to sit at the table, and then when I'm watching, I can't have them using like a think aloud protocol where they're like talking about what's in their minds, because that would like tip their hand to their opponent. But when they're playing a co-op game, everybody can be talking out loud, and I can get a really good idea of what's going on in all the players' minds.
And I guess it tends to help, at least from my perspective, with barriers to entry. Like you said, you have these casual gamers; they're not going to want to come and play something very competitive. So that's one thing that I really enjoy about the co-op games as well.
Yeah, that's no small thing. It's a great way to get new people into the hobby and up and running on your game.
So I guess, yeah, and then as I mentioned kind of before, the context of this is where it's a course on leadership in games. So how do you kind of feel that kind of the group dynamic and leadership aspect plays into those co-op games then? Do you kind of see, emerging leadership or people who you might not expect it take on those roles?
Yeah, I mean, this is not something I want to do with any kind of intent, designing cooperative games, but I've seen that people have used them in leadership situations where they're trying to talk about group dynamics a lot of times, and trying to figure out different roles that people play in a team. So the University of Leicester Medical School, I think is what it was, used pandemic to actually develop and examine different team dynamics within their teams of doctors who are just graduating or about to graduate from medical school. And because they recognize that many people are dying actually, because you have these weird authority issues in a like an operating theater, where you've got the doctor who's higher status and you've got the nurses or what have you that are lower status. And it's a real problem when they don't feel comfortable challenging the doctor, or kind of situations like that. And they've been able to kind of quantify that a certain large number of people are dying because of this. And so they try to take a page out of I think the aviation industry's ability to look at how those teams can challenge each other, and how they communicate and how they work together. And so rather than doing like a lecture to cover this topic, they wanted to do like a lab and like a practical experiment. And so they used pandemic for this. They had like just, I don't know, gobs, like at least 40 different people, if I recall correctly, like 10 tables of 4 playing the game. They'd have one person at each table with a clipboard. Yeah, I always imagine them wearing a lab coat, a clipboard, watching the people play, and then kind of graded them and talked about what kind of behaviors they exhibited playing the game, and then they'd play again and see what kind of with those behaviors in mind, that kind of feedback in mind, play the game and saw how they did, and saw like lots of increase in players' ability to do better once they got this kind of feedback and took that into account. So I bet that's one of the reasons, or one of the things that I saw the game being useful in, but again, not something I had designed it for or anything like that.
Sure. And I've seen, again, similarly with kind of the Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert style games where it's, you have this common mission very similarly. And it's a lot more about the thought process, like you said, the thinking out loud protocols and things like that works really well. And I think it's helpful for people who are, better at gaming, but not necessarily as into kind of stepping those leadership roles. They can feel a little bit more comfortable as well, which is one thing we kind of see.
Yeah, I mean, it's a safe space where you can all kind of try out different interpersonal communication styles. Where it's a game, so nobody's going to take it. You follow along the rules of this little contained space, and it's probably a nice safe place to try out new things.
Yeah, and I guess so that was kind of focusing more on the cooperative side, but I guess regardless of the game style, do you see kind of a place for leadership development in kind of the gaming world, whether it's game design or the playtesting side, or even just playing games? Maybe it'll expand upon what you said there, but kind of more generally.
I suppose I'm adjacent to this whole world, so I'm not sure. I mean, I see games as really this voracious thing where you can feed anything to it. So yeah, you can feed psychology, biology, illustration, storytelling, leadership. Why not? You throw it all in there, and it seems to just absorb it all and make use of it. It's a pretty omnivorous kind of practice.
Right. I guess that kind of leans heavily into just this idea of gamification, right? Is a big aspect where even in education, where we'll add specific points to assignments or leaderboards in classes, and you find that people want to kind of pressure to succeed in those. And I think that's kind of a neat side of playing games as well, as people are often more motivated because there's a game aspect to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole laboratory where you can play around with incentives, and you can try to figure out what kind of incentives actually move people. I mean, are the game's incentives aligned with the way the players actually want to behave? That's one thing. It's a really fascinating thing. Like, what's fun, and are the games incentivizing you to do something that's not fun, and what kind of tensions can you create? And so, yeah, it's a great place to examine that sort of stuff. And should you have intrinsic motivations for these sorts of things, or is it okay for you to just like layer on a layer of points on things? Does that work or not?
So changing gears a little bit, I'm curious to kind of your motivation. What inspired you to kind of commit donating some of the royalties to Doctors Without Borders and International Rescue?
Well, let's see. I guess it just felt like my wife and I do charitable donations, and this felt like this great marriage of, we have all this money coming in from the game, and we really believe in this cause, and it just seemed like a great way to channel that income into something that was more meaningful. And so, we didn't really advertise it much, but when people bought a game, they knew that part of the proceeds were going into MSF, and it helped with visibility, and it just seemed like a great thing to do.
Have you had a chance to kind of see, the downflow of those donations where, have you worked a little bit closely with them and able to see that effect, I guess? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we get the annual reports from them and a lot of mailings from them, and we can sit down, and sometimes they have webinars, and we're in touch with one of their staff. We can ask questions if we need to. So it's nice to see.
Yeah, for sure. So your games, particularly Pandemic, I think has been part of the board game renaissance of the early 2000s. I know that's a term that's thrown around. How did you kind of react to being part of that period in gaming history?
Favorably. I was just happy to be in the right place at the right time with the right product, I think, more than anything. I don't pretend that I could duplicate the success again. I think it just happened to be, I feel like the game's really good, but there's a lot of really good games out there. So I just feel like it hit just right at the right time, where there was this opening for a co-op, and games were really taking off at the time, and I had a publisher with a lot of support. So yeah, it kind of blew my mind that what's happened has happened, and just opened up a door for a new career for me. So very happy with it, I guess, is the short answer.
Yeah, I guess, and that's a good way to look at it, right? As you said, right place, right time. There was a lot happening all around then, from the 80s, 90s, your standard Milton Bradley games is what people were familiar with, and it kind of opened these eyes. So it's nice to see people getting a chance to play games that are a little bit more, as we talked about before, not just points on top of something for the sake. And so it's really nice to see that. So even more recently, kind of, and using Pandemic in a different sense, with the real world Pandemic, we've kind of led to a surge of gaming on more digital platforms like Board Game Arena or Tabletop Simulator, and with BGA kind of featuring a version of Forbidden Island. How do you feel those kind of experiences differ from in-person gaming?
Let's see. So I mean, they really filled a niche, I think, for myself and my friends for a year of or plus year and a half of isolation. So they sort of were a surrogate, I guess, for the tabletop. So much needed in that regard, where we just couldn't get together with people, so it was the next best thing. I'll pick a table over that any day though, and my use in that has just dropped off a cliff since we're able to get back together in person. I do think it continues to fill a niche though for people who still can't get together or want to play remotely. Like I played some games with my dad in Omaha, and that's been really great. So, but yeah, I mean they are digital versions of board games. They're not first and foremost digital games. So digital games are great for certain things. Board games are great for others. And so I think if you're going to play a board game, I definitely want to play it across the table because you can make direct eye contact with people. You can have the social experience. It's sort of like this excuse to have this social interaction around a table. And I don't think Board Game Arena does it to the same extent. I mean, there's also other things that they're useful. I mean, you could try games out before you buy them. Publishers can kind of give people sneak peeks and so on. But I think these are all kind of peripheral, at least for me.
Right.
Personally, it was a way to get together, semi-physically with people, over Zoom when we couldn't do it actually.
Yeah, I
And
feel like
it's also good for distance.
yeah, I had a similar experience obviously over the last year with we had a regular in-person game night, and those kind of ended, so we were able to jump on Board Game Arena when it first came out. But yeah, of course, as you said, kind of having the video chat as well is definitely a big thing. There's some players who will play just kind of the game. You lose out on the social aspect, which is a big part of gaming.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the flip side, as you mentioned, I ended up playing games with friends that I hadn't seen in years because they're living on the other side of the country, and it just became more normal. So there, definitely pluses and minuses for sure.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit now, I guess, about the game you've been working on, Daybreak. It's kind of reaching into the climate issues and those aspects. You said you wanted to be first and foremost a game. I kind of saw that in one of your previous interviews, and secondarily informative. So what role do you feel games have in kind of educating the public on these issues outside of that, and maybe talk a little bit about your Daybreak experiences in that response?
What role? Yeah, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I guess you can compare games to literature. Like, I mean, you can read a book about something and learn more about it. And if reading the book is enjoyable, then great. And then you get this information along the way. I think reading books is a little different, though. I mean, you may be really trying to learn deeply about something, and it doesn't necessarily mean if the text is dry, nonfiction, and the sentences are dull. If you get the information out of it, that's fine, right? I don't think games work quite like that. I think people have all these expectations of the genre where, if I'm going to play a game, I'm going to want some kind of engagement, even if it's not like I want to have fun. I want to be engaged. I want to have an experience that kind of moves me emotionally to some extent. I think is generally the way I think people, thinking about how people approach games. So for my part, for our part, I should say, I'm designing this with a co-designer in London, Matteo Menapes. We just looked at this and said, hey, we can't make this a quote educational game because our market's going to shrink to nothing, and then nobody's going to play it, and all of our work is pretty much for naught. Why do it if we're reaching 5% of the potential market we might otherwise could reach. But I think the reality of it is, like, we want to play these things and enjoy them as well. So I don't want to work on something for a year and a half and have it, play it and learn something and not want to return to it because it's just not enjoyable. So that was really our motivation. Let's make a really exciting game. And then as a side effect of playing it, you internalize how the systems, how the dynamics work. You see just by the card titles, right? You don't have to read blurbs on the cards. You don't have to read anything. You're just learning and internalizing this whole system based on the way it all interacts. You see the enormity of the problem. You see how emotionally engaging that is. What the stakes are. I see the idea that we communicate the idea that the solution is like a shotgun approach. There's many different paths to reaching net zero, and all this is just done implicitly, sort of tacitly. You pick it up by playing the game. Not, we're now going to tell you how to solve the climate crisis. It's not like that at all. So that was sort of the way we outlined it. We also had to kind of pick our battles too. We didn't want the game necessarily to be about all the political dynamics of why people are not taking action, which is a different game. I mean, it's a valid game, but it's not the game we want to pursue. We went for a, hey, let's assume that good faith on the part of the world leaders. So to some extent, this is a, a fantasy. We acknowledge that up front.
Right.
But it also allows us to kind of tap into a lot of engine building ideas. And so we can get this momentum built when you're playing the game that feels very satisfying and leads up to this crescendo where you either you succeed or you fail.
Awesome. It's good to kind of get that experience, which is another great segue. As high level as possible to kind of fit in, but can you talk a little bit about the process of going from this, idea to board games on shelves? What does that look like to you? Beyond, we talked a little bit about the iterative process, but finding publishers and kind of that process.
Yeah, I can take it really high level because I could probably talk for hours on this. Yeah, I mean, I just start with a brief, trying to figure out what the idea behind the game is and like who it's for. And that could just be a paragraph or a few sentences. It's generally not a whole lot more than what you see on the box, like number of players, how long it should take, age range, that sort of thing. And then I've generally got some kind of idea, which does typically come in like molecules of, some sort of thematic idea or story idea or mechanism kind of glom together. People ask all the time, do you start with a theme or a mechanism or a mechanic? And I'm like, I generally don't start with just one. I have some sort of idea, some sort of itch that I want to scratch. And then I'll start in a notebook. I'll do a quick prototype. And generally then I'm trying to find a core loop or a core game, some sort of central idea that drives the whole game forward and seems interesting. I'll expand that into a full game that I'll try to play with myself, just working out to see if I can get the thing stable enough, and then bring another player in. And then the whole idea is try to get a complete game experience, even if it's broken, just to from start to end, maybe totally imbalanced, but so I can see the shape of the thing. And gradually then just the process is one of expanding the number of people out and the fidelity of the prototype up, and then pulling my own involvement out. So I'm at the beginning, I'm the only person playing, and then I'm playing along with the players, and I'm watching the players in the same room, and then eventually I'm outside the room watching videotape of the people playing. And in order to do that, fidelity of the prototype has to go up. So the design decisions start getting more and more refined. Eventually, I've got a prototype that I can pitch to a publisher, and I don't have a lot of advice there because I did a lot of my pitching quite a while ago, and the doors are pretty much open to me, so I can approach people. But generally it's the same kind of thing. It's like, this is a game that serves this audience. This is the story of the game. This is how it might emotionally move the players. It's not, it's this mechanic plus this mechanic glommed together under this theme. I try to make it a little bit more meaningful than just mechanic A plus mechanic B, because I don't think that really is that's not what I want to see on the back of the box either.
Right.
I want to find out, what is this game going to make me feel? So that's how I like to pitch them.
So it sounds like theme is a very important issue. That was the first thing you mentioned and brought it up again, and this idea of the feelings, and that the game mechanics are secondary to that almost. Is that kind of
well? I think I would say that they both reinforce each other. So the mechanisms drive the game, and they create they help you do these dynamics or all the different changes within the game, and that makes you feel something. But the theme and the story to a large extent, they help explain what's going on. So if you were to try to explain a lot of these popular board games without the thematic elements, it would just seem like it's just symbol manipulation. And first, that's dry, and second, it's really hard to remember. So if you give thematic names onto everything, you're basically telling the story. And if you can relate this little chunk of wood into a community, you care about it much more than if it's just a victory point, right? So it just helps communicate meaning, and that allows it. We're storytelling creatures, so we store that in our brains, and we process them very, very differently than just generic symbols.
Great way to look at it. So you talked a little bit about the finding a publisher there, but in the last little while, we've kind of seen things like Kickstarter and Indiegogo leading to more crowdfunded, self-published games. How do you feel that's kind of led to, I guess, an expansion of, or maybe flooding of the game market?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I've never actually run my own Kickstarter, but it's easy to see some of the effects. I mean, the barrier to entry for new designers is lower, I think. Although you'd have to pick up a whole new set of skills. You have to learn how to be a publisher, which I don't know. Maybe it's easier, maybe it's not. So that's one thing. It just seems like a lot more product out there, and it seems like the product itself is being influenced by the way how easy it is to communicate to an audience and how sexy it looks to a would-be consumer. So that, you know, the number of plastic miniatures has blown up, or it's become like a genre into itself, as far as I can tell. Where, you know, if you can have this really long scrolling page that talks about all these amazing features, that's looked at a certain way by this audience, in a way that, like, looking at a really tight Knizia game, you know, it's not really designed for Kickstarter, right? So it's had an influence on the way that games are designed, I think, to a large extent.
Perfect. So I'm gonna wrap up with a two-part, probably very difficult question for you to answer.
Okay.
And I've been told it's much like asking a parent who their favorite child is, but what would you say your favorite of your games is, at least currently?
Well, it's hard not to point to the one that's allowed me to, you know, pursue a career in the field. So Pandemic just stands out. I mean, I've worked on it since I began my career, and I've got, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen different products that are related to it. So I originally thought it was kind of a brittle system, and I found out it's really robust and it can spawn all sorts of different kinds of games. So that's still enjoyable to work on. So I think I'd probably have to pick that as my first. But I think the truer answer may be whatever I'm working on right now is my favorite, because I don't go back and play, like, as a player. It's definitely whatever I'm working on now. I don't go back and play the back catalog because I have to test the things to death. So it's generally when I'm, like, teaching it to other people, and often I'm sitting to the side. So yeah, I would say right now there's a dexterity game and the climate game that I'm working on that are both. It would be tough to pick between them.
And then I guess to open up the catalog and make it a little bit more difficult, favorite game of yours that you didn't design?
Probably Knizia's Tigris and Euphrates, with Yellow Yangtze as a runner-up. Got a similar style game where it's a tile placing game with lots of difficult decisions. You only get 2 actions per round, and they're just the emergent effects of that game are really fascinating. It's a bit cutthroat, but I really enjoy that one quite a bit.
Right, well, awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of answer all those questions for me, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me.